Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 401k Marketing Podcast. Today, we are joined by Spencer Williams and Neal Ringquist of the Retirement Clearinghouse. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's good to be here.
Well, let's dive in and let's talk about the evolution of auto portability and the Portability Services Network. These are all new-ish terminologies in the retirement plan world, adapting technology. It's very exciting. So the Retirement Clearinghouse has been working to solve the issues of small account balances for quite a while, over a decade now. And can you walk us through, Spencer, the journey from identifying the problem to where auto portability is right now, today?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think, evolution is exactly the right word. The very first chapter of the story started with a very large plan sponsor client of ours, a huge hospital services company, 250,000 plus employees. And they hired us way back, like in 2007, to perform automatic rollover services for them. So you're familiar with those, right? Mm-hmm. Someone has at the time less than $5,000 in their plan.
Yep.
They can be distributed from the plan, on a mandatory basis. If they don't respond or do something, they end up in what's called a safe harbor IRA. Great. So we started doing those services for them. Very shortly thereafter, they asked us to build essentially a consulting service, a concierge service for them, for their new hires to bring money from former employers into the plan. Mm-hmm. And at the time, both these programs were disconnected, but we had a rather startling first couple of months. We called it roll in, really clever. We really hadn't seen anything like that in the industry before, but they thought it was a good idea. And so we built it. And that's kind of when the light bulb went off. So stage one was we said, hey, wait a minute, we're taking all these people out of an employer-sponsored plan and dumping them into these safe harbor IRAs where they sit and languish. Okay. And then we have this incredible employee satisfaction occurring over on this roll-in service. What if we figured out how to take the people out of the plan? So sort of a chocolate and peanut butter moment. Little did we know how complicated that would be, okay, to actually execute this. But we started off on the journey, to use your term. The second evolution was, we did some market research. We kind of sized how many of these things happen every year. And at the time, there was somewhere in the vicinity of 5 million participants a year who had less than $5,000 who were automatically distributed from their plan. And we also sized kind of the turnover market, right, which is how many people change jobs who have a 401k. And that was pretty close to 15 million people. And we were sort of stunned by the numbers. But we kept going on the journey. So we pulled a bunch of record keepers together and we said, hey, we got this crazy idea. And this now leads to the second stage of the journey. We had this crazy idea. We didn't know what to call it at the time. And we want to move people to their new employer plan. We think they thought, this is a great idea. We love it. Yeah. But we need you to get regulatory guidance from the Department of Labor to enable this on a negative consent basis. So negative consent is what the industry's become familiar with auto enrollment and QDIAs and auto escalation and all those kinds of things. And they thought it would work best if we did that. And they said, go get a reg. We said, oh, sure. 5 years later, we got an exemption from the Department of Labor, 2019 now. And that kind of kicked us into the third stage, which now we have the exemption. We started going back to the record keepers, because if you think about it for a second, you really have to create a network in order to get someone from an old employer plan or a safe harbor IRA into a new employer plan. Because you have these 5 million people kind of cycling through the system in every direction. So we always felt that the success would happen not just from the negative consent, the exemption that we received in 2019, but that we had to build a technology infrastructure. So now we're into the third stage. We had convinced everybody that with good reason, but deeply researched, cash out leakage was the primary motivation right, for doing auto portability. It's very simple. Right now we're simply casting these participants, or we were casting them off into the wind to fend for themselves, right? And frankly, we were losing customers and we're losing assets, and total leakage was like $90 billion a year. So it's not a small problem in any way, shape, or form. But the next step was to get record keepers to adopt. All right. So this is known. So there's no privacy here. We first got Alight to say yes, and then we got Vanguard to say yes. Now we're out into 2020 and 2021 respectively. And then Fidelity said yes. Okay. When Fidelity said yes, we now had the makings of critical mass. Okay. Which just all credit due to the three of them coming together and saying, we should do this for the benefit of participants, for the benefit of our business. We like incubating customers. And it was sort of that event that created Portability Services Network. And so Portability Services Network then very quickly, so that was 2022, we actually established and announced Portability Services Network, and now into the last stage of this thing until the next stage, right? The last stage of this thing was we then very quickly Empower and TIAA and Principal Financial Group came in. And with those 6 record keepers, we now had a 63% representation in the market if you look at participant counts. And that's where we are today.
Yeah.
Okay. But obviously we have enough oomph, if you will, to with those 6 record keepers to not only make auto portability viable through Portability Services Network, right?
Yep.
But also to kind of make it widespread in the market. So that's the evolution. Starts with a plan sponsor, and here it is today with 6 very large record keepers. There's something like 18,000 plans that have adopted as of a week ago. That's the last time I saw the numbers. We thought this was going to be just a service enhancement, deep public policy implications, keeping people invested in retirement, right? Deep technology, all the cybersecurity and data exchange things, that we had to kind of get over all of those hurdles to get to this point where we are right now, which is pretty rapid adoption.
I'm sure it was not easy to get to this point. And
I just condensed 14 years into approximately 12 minutes. Anyway, but anyway, yeah.
I think Spencer covered everything right there.
I did not.
Well, let's kind of talk about shifting demographics. So today we have a ton of people who we'll call them a mobile workforce. And that continues to expand pretty significantly. And small account balances, as we've talked about, usually just people say, give me the money, and they get cashed out. So what are some of the biggest challenges you see in helping those employees keep their retirement savings intact as they move from one job to the next?
Just very quickly, it's actually very simple, Rebecca. Okay. We go from a system that has just sort of a seems like an unending sequence of hurdles for a participant, and we turn them into nudges.
Nice.
Okay. So once you have a plan signed up for auto portability, you entirely change the dynamic because you have a negative consent. You change the messaging, right? From, hey, you got 4 choices to, hey, if you don't do anything, we're going to find your new employer plan and consolidate your money. And pretty soon you're going to have a nice account balance if you stick with this. All right. So it really is, you flip the entire dynamic around from hurdles to nudges.
Rebecca, let me just add to that. It's interesting because we did some research back in 2018 on the mobile workforce, but from a missing participant perspective, where we actually interviewed participants. It's pretty telling. Folks that we talked to, a third of them didn't even realize they had a 401k account because they were auto-enrolled into their plan. And when you broke that down by demographic, 50% of millennials in our survey didn't realize they had an account because they were auto-enrolled in it. So, one of the challenges first is, sometimes these folks have no idea that they were even enrolled in their 401k. So it's a communication issue.
We're going to see more of that most likely, unless, as you guys are continuing to work very hard to make that change what people's expectations are today. So the money follows them as they migrate from one company to the next.
It's an amazingly simple concept, isn't it?
It's
My
wonderful.
401k follows me when I change jobs.
Yeah. I'm thinking about some of my friends who have told me about their roll-in procedures they've had to do in the past, and the paperwork and the back and forth. And it was so taxing on them to actually get their money out of their former plan and into their new plans. It's that, I'll get to it, that back of the mind. And it takes years sometimes before people actually make that action. So this is excellent.
Sometimes it's never.
Right.
I'm laughing because 11 years ago, I left LPL Financial. I was one of their retirement consultants, and I still have a 401k balance there. So, it's a real thing.
Don't feel alone.
Right.
I feel a little shameful now about it after today's conversation.
Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I got to get me some of that roll in.
Yeah.
Right.
The first step, Rebecca, is admitting you have the issue. And now you can go and solve it.
Step one. Well, let's talk about the mechanics for a minute of auto portability. Specifically, our listeners are retirement plan advisors. They are industry professionals. Let's talk about those nuts and bolts. So auto portability, as we just talked about, is absolutely an innovation designed to reduce leakage and to consolidate retirement savings. So, Neal, can you break it down to the actual process of how it works, especially as advisors are listening here, and so that way they know what sound bites to use when they're talking to plan sponsors and to participants?
You bet. So you just conceptually, back to Spencer's point in the evolution, think about what we're doing. We've created a new default, right? The default now is around portability. What it requires is for a balance to move out of a plan, the terminated participant balance, and into a new plan. So let's go back to the enabling regulation to do so. To move out of a plan, we're simply piggybacking off of existing regulations. That's the mandatory distribution or automatic rollover regulation that allows plans to move these small balances out on a negative consent basis. So that's the set of regulations that govern that process. The roll-in, as Spencer mentioned, was first enabled through the prohibited transaction exemption issued to Retirement Clearinghouse. The other important piece along with that was an advisory opinion from the Department of Labor issued to Retirement Clearinghouse. It's important because it defined the fiduciary liability for the negative consent transaction. The Department of Labor said for that, it's not the plan sponsor, it's not the record keeper, it's Retirement Clearinghouse, the auto portability provider in that instance, is the fiduciary for that negative consent transaction. And because we're taking a fee, a one-time transaction fee on a negative consent basis, that's considered a prohibited transaction for which you need an exemption, okay? What happened was in the Secure 2.0 legislation, that exemption was codified into law, okay? So that's the regulatory framework. Now, going back to the original prohibited transaction exemption, that's important because the current operational guardrails of auto portability were established based on that exemption. And the first important part, it contemplated three configurations of auto portability. And this is how record keepers have set it up. So this is a really important point because in talking to advisors, oftentimes when they talk to their record keepers, it's like they have a different auto portability product across record keepers. And this is why. It's because each one adopts a different configuration. And the configurations speak to where a balance is sitting while we're looking for an individual in their new employer plan. Okay, so configuration number one, the plan can force that balance out in a mandatory distribution to a Retirement Clearinghouse Safe Harbor IRA. In other words, Retirement Clearinghouse is the Safe Harbor IRA provider. Okay. Configuration number 2 is they do the same thing, except they send it to the record keeper's proprietary safe harbor IRA. Similar to the same process, okay?
Okay.
You force out, and then it sits there while we're looking for the new employer plan. The third configuration, it actually stays behind in the old employer plan.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking for them while it's sitting there. And then when we find the individual, we go through the consent process, allowing the individual to opt out and so forth. If no response, then we move the money. It still has to meet the mandatory distribution reg. So it's got to flow through a safe harbor IRA. It's got to be forced out to a safe harbor IRA. In this instance, it's going through a no-fee conduit IRA for a matter of a couple of days just to satisfy those regs before it goes into the new employer plan, okay? So the record keepers that have signed up have adopted various configurations as contemplated by the Department of Labor, okay? Each record keeper and each plan has to be both sending and receiving, meaning they're sending eligible accounts of terminated participants, either that are sitting in a safe harbor IRA or in a terminated participant plan. And then they have to receive that in the form of a roll-in, all right? So mechanically, it's really just a simple data exchange process through this clearinghouse, this Portability Services Network clearinghouse. So in their capacity as sending record keeper or safe harbor IRA provider, data, just simply social security number and account number gets sent to Portability Services Network.
Mm-hmm.
PSN aggregates all that data from the sending side, takes that account number, drops it, attaches a randomly generated number, and then sends that data packet back to the record keepers in their capacity as receiving record keeper. They do queries on the plans that have signed up for auto portability based on that social security number to try to find the individual in the new employer plan. When they find them, then they simply send in a packet of information. They drop the social security number, add some PII like first name, last name, social address, date of birth, so forth. PSN takes that packet, asks for the same packet of information from the sending record keeper, runs it through a match matrix to make sure that the two individuals are one and the same. And then off that, to the extent that it passes, then it proceeds to the consent process, which can take 30 or 90 days, 60 days, depending on the configuration. So a letter goes out giving the individual the opportunity to opt out. This is a guardrail established by the Department of Labor.
Okay.
And then once that's exhausted, we go to the automated money movement process. So it's all automated. It's all done, at least data exchange via APIs. And the money movement process is automated as well. So mechanically, at the highest level, that's how auto portability works.
If you have a less than $7,000 account balance and your current employer is with Fidelity as a record keeper and your next employer is with Alight as your record keeper, there's a notice that gets sent out. You as the participant, once you sign in, all of a sudden, 60 days later, your account balance immediately transfers over. Did I get that?
You did, yeah. If the participant, they could actually consent, so the notification gives them the opportunity to opt out. But if they consent, if they call in and consent, then it just simply expedites the process. They could avoid the full time period.
Can you repeat the record keepers again? So we had Alight was the first.
Alight, Vanguard, Fidelity, Empower, TIAA, and Principal Financial.
Awesome. Okay. We're going to make sure to put them in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone has plans with any of those record keepers, and I imagine it's a couple forms on behalf of the plan sponsor that they fill out, a couple check boxes.
That's correct. Yeah, it's a packet. The record keepers have this down. There's typically some sort of amendment package to the record keeping services agreement to allow for the data exchange.
Yeah.
There's a contract, an auto portability contract with Portability Services Network. And then there's a contract with Retirement Clearinghouse as the fiduciary for these negative consent transactions. But it's all typically done in a nice, neat contract package that's oftentimes electronically signed.
Well, let's talk about the impact on participants and plan sponsors, because it's a real impact. Plan sponsors running around after missing participants. We all know the Department of Labor is interested in that. Participants undersaved, especially when you're young. I mean, when you're young and you see that, like, $3,000, you're like, woo, Cabo, let's go. But that $3,000, it in time grows to huge amounts. And we all know this. It's, the compound interest and time value of money. It changes their life if they don't go to Cabo that one time, or don't stay at the fancy hotel, but share a room, whatever it may be. You're in your 20s. So
or buy eggs.
Your best life.
Right.
Right. Buy eggs. Good God. Go big on a dozen. So beyond preventing leakage, what are some of the other lesser known benefits of auto portability, both for the plan sponsors and for those participants?
Rebecca, we'll start on the participant side. So you think about the alternative to auto portability is that these balances get forced out and sit in a safe harbor IRA. Okay?
Sure.
The regulations for safe harbor IRAs were passed in 2001 before the Pension Protection Act. So the default investment in a safe harbor IRA is still a principal protected vehicle, right? So, when we've had an environment like we had for 10 plus years of zero interest rates, there's just no return on these accounts. The better destination is to go into a plan where the majority of plans have a default that's a target date fund or a managed account that is a more long-term retirement-oriented investment than languishing in a money market account. When you add the fees associated with safe harbor IRAs, those accounts deplete over time. So that's a huge benefit. I mean, cutting leakage, yes, but also for these assets that sit for years in these safe harbor IRAs, it's much more beneficial to their retirement outcomes to have these balances sit in a more retirement appropriate long-term investment. So that's the other big part of the participant equation. On the plan sponsor side, you think about it, there's no fees to enroll. What's happening here is a plan sponsor is eliminating these small balance accounts. So obviously you're getting the benefit of avoiding some of the administrative hassles that go along with those. So uncashed checks, for example, and missing participants. Yeah. So that's a big win right there. But you're eliminating accounts, but assets are coming in. So you're retaining assets, removing accounts. Over time, your average account balance in your plan goes up. Yep. For most plans, that's a huge success metric, is when you see your average account balance go up. Oftentimes, it's used as a negotiating tool for record keeping fees and so forth. So that's a big win for plans when you see that happen over time.
I'd like to add a little bit, throw in a kind word for advisors. All right. There shouldn't be an advisor on the planet that is opposed to auto portability. And the reasons flow from what Neal just said. When you look at the plans and what's happening, right, is yes, right today, money's just coming out of the plan. We sort of use a landfill and recycling metaphor every once in a while, Rebecca, but they disappear and they're not in the plan anymore. And they're not in an advised IRA. That's not what's happening here. All right. They're just going sort of a dead letter drop here. With auto portability, new monies are coming into the plan in addition to contributions. All right. And that is advisor's business. Right. And so you're actually sort of simultaneously, increasing the benefit of the plan to an advisor, but you're also incubating accounts that at the end of the road may turn out to be great advisory accounts for them on an individual basis.
Yeah, I mean, extrapolate out 30 years, the average person sits down with the advisor for the first time around.
Yeah, you do this a couple of times. If you get someone, who's inclined to cash out, because like you said, Rebecca, small balance, you do that a couple of times and suddenly you have a meaningful account when you consolidate it on a continual basis. And we also know that people's behavior changes when their account balance goes up. So much less inclined to cash out a $20,000 account versus a $5,000 account.
So auto portability has shown to have a very positive impact, as we've just been talking about, but also on underrepresented communities as well, particularly minority workers. So what trends are you seeing, and how does this initiative help close some of those retirement savings gaps?
Yeah. So Rebecca, so go back to, when Spencer talked about the evolution and the cash out leakage problem and that 55% for these small balances. Well, when you look at the cash out rates of minorities, low income workers, so African Americans are cashing out at a 63% rate overall. Low income workers, in the over 50% overall, not just these small balances. So when you plug leakage, it benefits these underrepresented groups more. That the undersaved and underserved benefit more from plugged cash out leakage because those groups are cashing out at higher rates. So it disproportionately benefits these populations. Auto portability does, and so think of it basically using the retirement plan to start to address that minority wealth gap, and that's sort of the vision behind auto portability is to help these groups. Yeah.
I'd like to throw in a word. Our Retirement Clearinghouse's single largest investor is a fellow by the name of Robert L. Johnson, Bob Johnson. All right. Founder of Black Entertainment Television, first African-American billionaire in the country. And when we put this together back in 13 and 14, and we showed Bob what was going to happen, Bob became personally involved in taking the message out, not as an investor, as in calling his friends,
sure,
working the political side of things and all that kind of stuff. And I want to be careful of misquoting, but some research came out from EBRI, I think yesterday, that showed that auto portability could reduce the wealth gap by or increase the people who are ready for retirement. That's the better way to say it, Rebecca, by 11%, all by itself. So that's a big number for something that will be mechanical. When this is all done and widespread adoption, it will simply be a technological event. No one will ever actually even see what's going on, in a manner of speaking. Yeah.
It's pretty easy to breadcrumb your way forward and see that this is just going to be table stakes in the future. Right. And so great foresight to both of you for coming up with this idea. So let's dive into our last question, which kind of goes off of this. Where do you see the Portability Services Network and Retirement Clearinghouse going over the next 5 to 10 years? What's next?
Well, first of all, despite everything we've said to you, Rebecca, the job is not yet done. Okay. We have a fairly sizable number, 10 to 12, 15 of kind of top tier record keepers, who have substantial books of business, who have not adopted yet. Now we're in discussions with all of them. So I'd love to look way into the future, but we're probably better off making sure that we, enable through the technology implementation, system-wide adoption. The other way to say that is we're having great success. We have 18,000 plans. Pardon me, but there are 700,000 plans in the defined contribution system. Sure. So there's plenty of room to go. All right. Now, having said that, there's kind of one more near-term thing, which I called scalability. Auto portability is highly scalable. Okay. And we need to get to the point where we can take advantage of some of those economies of scale and frankly, reduce the price to the market. All right. So that's while you're continually improving operations, which is just kind of what you do, there's this goal of hitting kind of that first point of scalability where we can capture those economies of scale. And the way Portability Services Network is constructed is it's not a profit-seeking enterprise. So when we get there, we will have the ability to reduce the price to the consumer. All right. So that's pretty cool. If you look out over the horizon, we've been traveling on this road for a while now. And one of my favorite events is when someone comes up with a new idea for how to use a network. All right. I'm going to give you one, which is the savers match. Okay. And so most of your listeners will be familiar, at least some with savers match, enshrined in Secure 2.0 back in 2022. The simple story is when you look at the network and the locate, match, and money movement functions, which are the heart and soul of auto portability, it can be directly applied to the savers match.
Oh, that's great.
And one other, Rebecca, just seed to plant, because you think about it, in the retirement industry, we've never had a network of connected record keepers like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So think of all sorts of useful tools this could present. So one of them, the survey that I referenced on missing participants, well, in that survey, it indicated that the most reliable address record is the address record associated with the active participant account. Well, gosh, we've got a network now that gives us access potentially to address records from active participant accounts. So here's a potential source of new address data to address the missing participant issue for terminated participants. So, that's just using the network to solve problems like that out in the future. That's an example of how it could add value to issues other than just simply, portability or plugging leakage. Very powerful.
Yeah, I kind of see a day, that'll probably exceed, my business lifetime or move beyond that, where all kinds of different services are being in the network, and they're not originated by Retirement Clearinghouse, right? There's the service providers themselves have ideas already on things that they could do. The simplest one is the technology is entirely indifferent to the size of the account balance. All right. So if there's a point for solving the problem that you have, leaving your account at LPL, and I'm not telling you to wait, okay, because it could take a while. You should get at it, Rebecca. But
it's not going to happen today, Spencer. I promise.
It's not going to happen today. You're kind of busy today. Gee, I've heard that before. But in any case, you see the point is that you could have a very beneficial outcome for service providers, for advisors, for participants, most of all, if you were able to use the technology to move larger account balances.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Secure 3.0 or 4.0 or
something
whatever
like
edition it is in the future. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining today. Any last words, advice for fellow listeners? And then obviously, how do they contact you to learn more?
Parting thought is, particularly for advisors, auto portability is nothing to be afraid of. It's actually beneficial to the industry and to advisors as a whole. I think we've explained that. They can certainly, if they have a client that's interested, best to go through their record keeper. The record keeper's responsible for onboarding their plan sponsor clients. If the advisor has any interest in talking to us, they can simply contact us through the psn1.com website.
Thanks, Rebecca. It was pretty interesting to talk to you today. Always enjoyable.
Thank you guys so much for joining today's podcast, and thank you everyone for listening. If you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to Spencer Williams and Neal Ringquist directly. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for listening to today's 401k Marketing Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of our guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of 401k Marketing. The content has been available for informational and educational purposes only. We hope you enjoyed.